Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today at the U.S. Embassy in Yerevan is Dr. Evelyn Farkas, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. And she's here in Armenia because her portfolio is Eurasia, Russia, the Ukraine. Dr. Farkas, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for giving us the time.
Thank you, thank you.
I know what happens during these quick visits. You're going to see everybody, you know, who is anybody in government, and we appreciate your giving us the time because one of the reasons you're here is to also make an announcement. Yes,
actually, I'm very pleased to be able to announce. I'm here, obviously, it's part of our regular consultation with the government, with the Ministry of Defense, so I'm not here just to make an announcement, but I am actually happy to be able to say that we're expanding our cooperation with the government of Armenia, with, in particular, the armed forces, to work on doing some peace operations training. And this is something that we do with a lot of countries all over the world, actually, from Asia, from not just Eurasia. And essentially what we're doing is creating partnerships between the United States and these countries, but more importantly, global partnerships so that we have armed forces that can deploy with us in peace operations, UN peace operations or any other peace operations. And Armenia, as you know, is doing this already, but we're trying to help build that capability further.
This is a program that the GA, the U.S., have been involved in since early in the 2000s. Just by memory, I mean, if this is a program that started at a time when Iraq, Afghanistan, the engagement there was very different. Why the need to continue the program now and to add additional partners?
Well, I mean, I think as you see all around the world, from Africa through to the Middle East, there's still, unfortunately, a crying need for peace operations. And so every contribution is very valuable. Armenia is active with us in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, is planning a deployment to Lebanon with the Italians. So the skills that we are helping teach the Armenian armed forces can be used in all of these operations.
Is it something that Armenia applies to be a part of, or does the U.S. select countries? How does it work?
It's more of a selection process, but obviously we don't just select willy-nilly. I mean, there's obviously an interest on the part of the Armenian government. The Armenian Ministry of Defense has been working very carefully over the last couple of years to build up their peacekeeping brigade. And so we essentially are supporting their priorities. So it's not as if we've told them that they should be doing this. It's really more the other way around, that we've recognized, aha, they're building something here, something really valuable, and so we should really partner with them to help them take this to the next level.
Is peacekeeping different from policing? Has the experience been that the experience gathered in this sort of program and these sorts of places, does that transfer, that culture of policing, does it transfer to domestic efforts, or are they really two different worlds?
They're completely different worlds. You know, there is an international police effort, which is something that is not the concern of the armed forces and of our Department of Defense. Of course, those are usually helpful to have in conjunction with the peace operation, but that's a separate issue. That's law enforcement. Peace operations are essentially a military affair, and they can range from a peace enforcement mission, which you know, UN. Usually it's a UN operation where you have a mandate, although it doesn't have to be UN, but you have a mandate to use force if necessary, or it can just be peacekeeping where you're not really there to enforce the peace, you're there to keep it. So
the US-Armenia security relationship goes beyond just this one program.
Of course.
It's really hard for us in Armenia to sometimes understand why the US way over there can or wants to or needs to engage in that kind of relationship. We know why we need it.
Right.
But why does the U.S. and how does the U.S.?
For the United States, we really are interested in achieving what the OSCE put out several years ago, this Europe whole, free, and at peace. That's very important to us. And we also have a little bit of self-interest in as much as we want stability in other parts of the world. And so if we have European partners who can come with us and deploy with us to secure peace elsewhere, that's also in our interest. But primarily, in the first instance, we want to support the Armenian government's efforts to professionalize their military, to reform their military. I spent some time with the Minister of Defense this morning. He talked to me about his anti-corruption efforts, their efforts to create a new modern non-commissioned officer corps. So these are things that are good for Armenia, but they're also good for the West and for Europe writ large, because you have then common operating principles. And in fact, Armenia can also deploy with NATO because they're learning through us how to be interoperable with NATO. So they don't have to be a NATO member, but they can come with us and learn how to literally communicate with NATO officers. One
of the other things the OSCE talks about is the indivisibility of security. Talk about that. That's so hard to understand.
Well, I mean, I think that we have common security interests. I think having instability in one part of Europe can clearly affect other parts of Europe. It's not just security in a narrow sense in terms of whether there's conflict or not, but you can have impediments to economic development if you don't have the sense that there is stability in a government or in a particular region. You won't get foreign investment, for example, and that's why there's a lot of discussion about what kinds of trade relationships countries should have, because essentially they want to have better security, and that will allow them to have stronger trade relationships.
How much of the reform efforts that you also support depends on steps that the government and the military need to take without you? Things like language skills, things like social science, critical thinking, even management skills. How much of that is a prerequisite? How much of that is what you support and feed?
Well, I think every government needs to have an interest, and I think essentially these are all, as I mentioned before, we are responding to the Armenian government's interests and by extension the interests of the Armenian people. So we need, of course, some basic interest. The English language capability is key, and to the extent that the Armenian government can provide that to their people before they join the military, that is very helpful. But the United States does have programs where they help with English language, and you know, there are a whole host of programs that our government has beyond, of course, the defense sector.
You know, the Minister of Defense, the Deputy Minister have talked about that, and it's the kind of thing that we never think about, you know. I mean, something as basic and simple as language skills, otherwise how are you interoperable at the end of the day?
Yeah, yeah.
It's amazing how complicated it is. Let me ask you a final, totally unrelated question. You taught at the Marine Corps College, and you taught international relations. Do you teach that differently when you're teaching the Marines than when you teach a regular fourth-year university student?
No. The only difference is that the Marines as students, they tend, at the command and staff level, they are more experienced, they are older, and they tend to be a little bit more opinionated. And every once in a while you have a class where you can turn to them and they can talk about, for example, I taught a class on peace operations, and I had a student in there who had deployed to Haiti. And so I essentially sort of turned the class over and said, well, Major, why don't you talk a little bit about your experience. So in that respect, it's different than undergraduates who obviously don't come into university with experience in peace operations in the Caribbean.
Okay, I lied. Last question. You're a woman in a man's world, which is probably difficult enough in the US. I think our Armenian audience is going to be very interested in seeing that I'm talking to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Dr. Evelyn Farkas. Is that a plus card or a minus card in this part of the world?
I think it's both. I think that I don't think it makes that much of a difference, to be honest. I think, you know, I'm a professional just as my male counterparts are professionals. And
they get to that. They get past the initial shock and get to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're serious and you're serious-minded, then that comes across. And you know, maybe I can't compete and be as charming as Minister Ohonyan, but I can try.
No, he's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for giving us the time.
Thank you very much.
We've been speaking with Dr. Evelyn Farkas, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and is in Armenia because she has the Eurasia, Russia, Ukraine portfolio, and to announce Armenia's new partnership with the US in the Global Peacekeeping Operations Initiative. Thank you for following us on CivilNet.